and welcome to another edition of TT Online Community Voices. I'm Ainka, and we will be having a lovely discussion this afternoon on financial security as we continue to give you information you need to make informed decisions. Now, to do so, I am joined by two experts. First off, Mr. Nicholas Dean, an independent financial consultant. And also joining me is Mr. Jason Julien, the Deputy CEO of FCB. Gentlemen, hello and welcome.
A pleasure, pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining me, because when we talk financial security, particularly credit, stocks and bonds, investments and things of that sort, people get nervous. So let's dispel some myths immediately. Kicking things off, stocks and bonds. The terms have been used together for as long as I can remember, but of course there are distinguishing features of each. So, Jason, please distinguish what is a stock, what is a bond, and how we should use them.
So if you don't mind, you said something very interesting in your opening, which I wouldn't want us to overlook. And you used the term financial security. Mm-hmm. And maybe we could spend a little time before we dive into the deep end of the pool, talking a little bit about what financial security is. And I know, Nicholas, you and I, we could talk for hours about these things, but at least want to make sure that as the audience kind of deep dives into the issues, that we clarify the language as we go along, so that it doesn't feel as scary or intimidating or distant to anyone watching. So maybe financial security, and I'm going to take a little stab at it. And Nicholas, I mean, I know you are expert in this area as well too. Yeah. But I would think that I would want to make sure that people understood the term. And as I define financial security, it really means, as the name suggests, having enough financial assets to cover your expenses, to cover emergencies, to cover retirement, and also having a little extra. Okay. And security is a funny word these days, right? Because, I mean, we live in such a time that things could feel insecure at times. Mm-hmm. So financial security is really having that peace of mind, knowing that no matter what may come around the bend, that you have enough to take care of your circumstances. Yeah?
I think I could add to that from the standpoint of, so we use that in a qualitative standpoint, but, in our field, we have to quantify things. So sometimes people need to know, okay, what exactly does that translate to in actual numbers? And I would say the first point would be, you want to make sure you have short-term funds, savings that you can respond to things like emergencies. So maybe 3 months of your salary could be set aside, and then you could start building on that for the long term. So financial security, I think, is, as Jason said, there is a short-term part of it that you can deal with the present and the near future, and then as you get older, you have a degree of comfort knowing that, one, your income needs are met, and your ability to respond to medical issues down the road can also be met.
We all know medical issues are top of mind right now.
Yes.
And that could be a reason why a lot of people are still very uncertain as to how they define financial security.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why we're going to demystify. We're going to explain everything on a granular level to make sure that, as we said, we can make informed decisions about our future and our current day. Yes. So currently, I'm interested in stocks and bonds, but I have done my Google search, and the first few hits are still confusing.
No, I know.
Distinguish for me the difference.
And that's the thing, right? So there's so much information out there. Mm-hmm. There's lots. So I think we live in a time where information, you press a button, get answers. But that doesn't necessarily mean information means education and awareness and understanding.
Correct.
And thankfully, we're here to try and help with that.
Yes.
So stocks and shares, I grew up watching lots of movies. And some of my favorite movies growing up were things like Wall Street. Right. And looking at all of these stockbrokers. And it looks exciting. It looks interesting. But I had no idea what was going on at the time.
Same.
And we use the terms, and we grew up here in stocks, here in shares. And it usually sounds like someone who is wealthy has these things, and who has access to these things. Mm-hmm. So bear with me. I'm going to try my best to try and define each. So we all hear the terms stock and share, and let me start with share. So a share really takes us back to the basics, where it really means a share of ownership of a company. So when you hear the term share, really, it is that share of ownership of a company. And with that share of ownership, there comes a couple of things. There's the right to participate in the profits of the company, maybe get dividends, maybe even have the right to vote on the future of the company and its direction. But that's really where the term it originates from, having that share or portion of ownership and portion of its profits.
Okay.
And the term stock is similar, and actually, to be fair to everyone looking on, it's used interchangeably. For the most part. So we say here shares, here stocks, and generally it means the same thing. It means the ownership of a business. But stocks really is meant to be more general in terms. So when you hear stock, you actually hear it more in the plural.
Okay.
So it means the collective shares that you may own, or you may hear the term stock exchange,
Right.
which really means the collection of shares that trade every day on this exchange that has prices that could go up and down. Now, there's a lot we could talk about here, right? But maybe before I kind of give Nicholas the floor, what I might say is that one of the benefits of even having these things called shares or stocks, which is the ownership of a business,
Right.
is really the dividend income you could receive, because you're not putting your money into something without understanding why. So part of it is that dividend income you could get as a source of returns, and then also, of course, if the share trades on a stock exchange, which also is called a publicly listed share, you have the chance for that share to go up and down, and over time increase in value. But there's a lot we could kind of dig into right there.
Before you go further, dividends in its simplest form would be return.
Yeah, so dividends is really when a company makes profit at the end of a particular period, and thankfully we have so many great businesses here in Trinidad and Tobago. When those businesses deliver that profit at the end of that financial period, to the owners, you, the owner, get to share in that profit. And how they normally do that is they distribute to the owners cash, and that cash is called a dividend.
Beautiful. Making sure we get granular,
Yes,
because
of
persons
course.
will be intimidated by just words.
No, you're very
so
right.
we're making certain we are clear on that.
Yes.
Anything to add to this,
Yeah,
Nicholas?
actually use the word return. Return, I like to look at it as you send your money, your savings into the future as an ambassador, and it returns with friends.
I
Wow,
like that.
I love that.
You
So-
send your money into the future and it returns with friends. Okay.
And those friends could be some form of an income, like dividends, as Jason was saying, or it could be like interest on things that generate interest. We call them lending instruments. Returns can also mean that the thing that you invested in, the value would have gone up. We call that capital appreciation. So returns can come in different forms. Another form of return is like rents. If you have a property,
Right.
and that property is increasing in value, but it could also generate a rental income. So these are different forms of rewards for parting with your money and investing it into the future.
Doesn't sound so scary after all.
No, it's really simple.
Now, the other mention was bonds.
Yes.
So this is another facet of investment.
Yeah.
What exactly would that be?
Right. So you're gonna I'm gonna try my best to break this one down, because the term bond is a part of the vocabulary that we hear on movies and investments. And of course we all hear government bonds, and it sounds really safe and exciting, and it is.
Right.
But a bond really is, in its most simplest sense, is an arrangement whereby an investor essentially lends someone money, but under specific terms. So if I use the example of a government bond, in the simplest sense, you as an investor effectively are investing in the government's plans, and the government is borrowing that money and telling you as an investor, listen, for this defined period of time, some cases a year, some cases 30 years, I'm going to, over that period of time, do a couple of things. I'm going to pay you interest for the fact that you've lent me that money, and at the end of a particular period, I'm going to return that money to you. So the terms and conditions of this arrangement are known upfront, and it's called a bond because it's structured as a legal transaction with specific terms and conditions. Now, without confusing anyone, it's also called a fixed income security, because you know from upfront what the cash flows are going to be like. You know you're going to get a particular cash flow at this period of time, and you know you're going to get your return in capital at another period in time.
Yeah. I could probably add to that from the standpoint of, just using a play on language here. Bond, your word is your bond. So you're kind of
Yes.
locked in. So there's a kind of security
that.
that you get with that type of a contract. I think just to differentiate as well what a bond is and what it's not by comparing it to stocks and shares. A bond, you have a relationship with somebody by lending them the money and they return the money to you. But when you buy a share or a stock in a company, the person that you did the transaction with, the person that you bought it from, you no longer have a relationship with that person. And they are not obligated to give you back your money.
Right.
You have to get somebody else to take it off your hands in exchange for cash.
I like the distinctions.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
Because what we have heard, as you said, is a lot of movie language
Yes.
and not a lot of distinguishing factors.
Yes.
So now they seem far more relatable or accessible
Yes.
than they would have before. As you mentioned earlier, it seems like things that wealthy people have. But now the man on the street, who may not be as wealthy as he'd like to be, can in fact get into the stocks and bonds of the world. Yes. We will, of course, delve into how to do that exactly, because you mentioned earlier when we talk about rental and income, that is a very easy way to make some income.
Yes.
But stocks and bonds do exactly that for us. How do we begin to explore that option as an average person, whether you are self-employed, freelance employed, or a regular government job?
No, great question. And I think Nicholas and I, we spend a lot of our time talking to people about those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I think, if I may take a first stab, I think the starting point actually is understanding your current financial situation,
Right.
and understanding your goals. And that may be simple to say, but difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So the first part, understanding your current financial situation, it means sitting down with your family with a pen and paper and a calculator and actually itemizing, where do I get income? What do I spend my money on? And what are our goals? And I want to at least start from that point, Nicholas. And I'm not sure if you where we should go next.
Well, that speaks to budgeting, because before you can even think about investing in things like bonds and stocks and stuff like that, you should have adequate cash to deal with things like the short term. So part of that financial planning at the dinner table with the family would include how much of this paycheck should we set aside to deal with the short-term needs if an emergency should happen. And once that is done and we have that covered, we can say, okay, I have a little more money than I need in cash. I can now send that into the future and I can start exploring that additional fund into things like the stock market and government bonds and so on.
Fair.
Another thing I wanted to add as well is that you talked about real estate just now. And actually the average person on the street, I would say, can more quickly invest in stocks and participate in bond investments versus buying a property outright, because the capital that you need to invest in real estate is way more than you could participate in something like the stock market.
Interesting.
Yes.
So maybe we'll see how one can lead to the other.
Yes.
Exactly.
But I realize that you both use the example of a family, a collective.
Yes.
When people who may be single and have income at disposable, whether it be extra income or come into a large sum of money, they may be thinking stocks and bonds as well. And yes, a budget is still necessary, but it still leads me to, where do I start?
Right. And I think part of the start is making a distinction in your mind also between your savings and your investments.
Right.
So part of that is your time horizon, because savings-wise, it's akin to what Nicholas touched on in terms of having money for emergencies, having money set aside for expenses, or planned or unplanned, and being prepared in that regard. And that is part of the financial security. Investments-wise, leads to your goals. So even as an individual or as a family or as a would depend on your stage of life, your goals vary. Right. So there's no one particular formula, I would say, for any person, but because it really will depend on your particular circumstances.
Yes.
But from an investment point of view, when you determine what your goals are, you then can map out a plan of action to determine, okay, well, is a bond right for me at this time? Because at a different point in time in your life, it may be. So if I were to start off, like, say, if you were a young professional, straight out of university, and you have your first job, your goals may be very different from the person who is a more mature professional steering retirement round the corner.
Right.
The decisions you will make will be so distinctly different. And also, the choices you make in terms of where you put your money and invest will be very different as well, too.
Right. One of the things we hear is often risk, levels of risk, what
Yes.
you're willing to endure. So that, I imagine, plays a part in deciding on whether or not you want to invest altogether.
Well,
Yes?
Yeah.
I would probably add to what to just play on what Jason was saying is that the key word that he used there was time horizon.
Yeah.
And in finance, one of the first things you learn is the time value of money. But also when you're planning with your goals, each goal may have a different time frame.
Right.
And the goals, so it's all about aligning your goals with the appropriate investment vehicle or instrument. So you want to match short-term goals with short-term investments, meaning that investments that are not high risk.
Okay.
And then the longer-term goals that you don't need to see your money for 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. Doesn't have to be a lump sum. It could be smaller amounts that you're putting aside on a regular basis. Those monies can then be invested in things that have a little more risk because you need to give it time to work that risk out.
Okay. So from what I'm hearing, I feel a lot more relaxed when it comes to, at least in terms of stocks, bonds, and even shares. We know the credit union shares, we've heard of the government stocks and bonds, but another one that we're familiar with that also is kind of scary is credit.
Right.
Now, there's a distinction to be made. There are lines of credit, there are credit scores, there are all sorts of facets to credit. So, gentlemen, who will take the lead on this one?
Oh, gosh. I feel I've been going ahead.
Yeah,
I'll
you
take
go.
the second ball this time.
You buy the first rounds.
So, let's talk credit.
Okay,
What is
great.
credit?
Okay, so credit is money that's available to you that is not yours. So it's
sense.
access to money. Pretty much is money that you'll be borrowing.
Okay.
And of course, as we spoke about in bonds, with respect to bonds, it has to be paid back. And so once you are talking about I have credit available, it means that I can borrow money when I need it. But knowing that, one, I have to pay it back. And then I also have to pay rent on the money, which is interest. So credit is that availability of borrowed funds. There's a distinction, I would say, in terms of the language. When does credit become debt? Credit becomes debt when credit is utilized. So from the time you utilize credit or access the credit, it immediately transforms into debt. So now you have a debt. You now owe the money, and now you have to incorporate that in your financial plans.
That was a thought I should have had before I had my first credit card. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, of course.
Because I think that's pretty thorough.
No, I think that's pretty solid. But the only thing I'll add is in terms of the use of credit and the power of credit. So, there's a quote I always kind of refer to where money being a good servant but a terrible master. And if you think about that long and hard, and credit is a good example of that.
Yes.
If you know how to make credit your servant to help you achieve your dreams and your goals, then it will be wonderful. So we all have goals, right? So some of us want to buy your first car. Some of us may want to buy a first home.
Right.
Some of us may want to send our children to university abroad, or just get other goals accomplished that will take credit and access to credit. And if you make it a good servant, you can achieve these goals comfortably within financial security.
Yes.
When it becomes a terrible master, when it is you have a credit card or a mortgage or a loan or a car loan that unfortunately you're not managing well, then it could lead into a circumstance where these debts become burdens and become masters, which could really lead you down a terrible path.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of good that comes from having debt if you use it as well as a good servant to achieve your goals in a well-managed way. So I think I just want to add that because, it's sometimes people think that being debt-free is the only way, or sometimes there's the other extreme where you borrow as much money as you can.
Right.
But I think there's a nice middle ground that is optimal.
Yes.
That you find that balance, achieve goals in a managed way.
Yes.
You definitely use the word manage perfectly.
Yes.
Because it is a balance that you need to
Correct.
strike. So that I'm hearing credit not being bad altogether, debt being real,
It is real.
and Bonds, stocks, and shares being perhaps the bridge between the two, because you can set goals and achieve those goals using both your credit, your investments, and achieve financial security. We're getting there.
Maybe I could give you an example.
Yeah.
Let's run a case scenario, right? Let's just say we have a young person in their 20s and now starting off in life, and they would ultimately they'd like to have a family, they'd like to live in their own home,
Right.
but they're comfortable in their parents' home right now or wherever they're living. And they want to start on that journey. So the first thing they need to do is set aside money, which is to save. Then they could start investing. Let's say they have a 5, 10, 15 years down the road before they decide on buying a property.
Right.
So they can start building up money so that they can have like a down payment. Because most times, most people are unable to purchase a property with cash as a cash purchase. It's usually with the assistance of credit by way of a mortgage. And obviously, you have to come to the table. You should come to the table with something. So in preparation for acquiring a home, which is a goal in itself for many reasons. Right. It's not just financial, it's somewhere to live and security and all the things that brings to the table with. You can now bring your savings to meet credit to create an asset that goes up in value, provides you with housing, and that's where credit can now really be, or debt can really be something that could really advance you. Far too often, I've found people, as Jason was saying, he's talking about a servant and a master. I could use another set of language as well, which is weapon and tool.
Correct.
You can, if you use a tool in the right, if you use something in the right way, it can be a tool.
Right.
But if you misuse it, it can be a weapon against yourself. So I think it's really understanding what's the right place and time for the use of these things, and really think about what you're going to do with the money once you've borrowed it. And then if it is that you have, you're at a point where you have misused credit and you have developed, like Jason was saying, you may have stopped your payments and stuff like your credit rating could have been, your credit score could have been affected. And then when you really need money down the road to do something important, it's against you.
Well, Nicholas, you've absolutely brought up something we have to explore. I was going to hold off on it, but let's talk about that credit score. Let's talk about acquiring debt and not being able to manage and what happens after. Because we've heard too many times persons going to financial institutions with debt, being turned away and thinking that absolutely cash is necessary. You can't do anything with credit. So there are a lot more myths we have to get into, and I want to start with that credit score.
Okay, I would say long ago when people used to borrow money, they knew each other. Right. When I grew up in banking 30 years ago, it was a lot of relationships. So I knew your family, I knew your cousins, I knew everybody. I would lend you based on the character of the people that I'm dealing with. But as things became, populations grow and more and more people join the banks and so on, you now don't have the ability to keep up with those relationships. So now you need a tool where you could deal with a complete stranger and assess them right away to give them a very valuable tool, which is credit, whether it's to buy a car, to buy a home, and so on. And credit score does that work for you. Your credit score takes into account your history of borrowing. It takes into account how much of that available credit did you utilize. Because if you maxed it out, then obviously that kind of goes against you. But if you had credit available, but you didn't completely utilize it, then it kind of reflects well on you. If you would have, in terms of your credit history, if you would have borrowed and you paid back on time and stuff like that, that augurs well for you in the future. So that's how I would say the credit score comes into play. And it actually came from, I think it's an American company that I think is Fair Isaacs and Company, which is called FICO, and that FICO score is based on different algorithms that they use to come up with a numerical value to assess an individual's ability or credit worthiness, that they can be trusted. Even though you're a stranger, that number can assist you to get credit, even though the banker doesn't know you as they used to.
And now let's talk to the banker.
Yes.
Because, yes, we understand now what your credit score is, but how to manage that or influence that is where banks can give us a little bit more advice, I imagine.
Wow. So, the bank relies on the credit score because, as Nicholas pointed out, the reality is, even though relationship banking is still important,
Right.
there's just so much you can't track these days. And that's a good thing because there's a lot going on,
Correct.
right? But the challenge, of course, for us as borrowers is that, our behaviors then determine our future potential. And that's true for so many endeavors in life. So in terms of as it relates to the credit score is your behavior. If you pay your bills on time, if you're ducking tea and tech and courts and WASA, it's being tracked. And I think people misjudge the fact that there's so much of their lives is being recorded
Right.
and being recorded and collected and then shared.
That was the part.
Yeah.
Because I think there is also some misconception or, I guess, gray areas as to what is tracked. So we're talking any sort of borrowing, basically, whether it's a financial institution, retail. Where else can we look at that?
So there's a lot out there, right? So the part of the reason of the know your customer or knowing who you are is also knowing where you pop up in society and interact. So in terms of public information, there's your utility bills definitely.
Right.
Other credit you may have access with other financial institutions.
Right.
Your credit cards, your loans and borrowings, your repayment history, even your employment track record. All these things get recorded in databases over time and collected. And they try to distill all this into neat numbers and reports.
Okay.
And these reports that the financial institutions rely upon. And unfortunately for a borrower, if you have a really bad pattern of behavior, it could affect you and affect you negatively. And if you think about it long and hard, justifiably so. Because unfortunately, if you have a bad track record of repayments, a bad track record of being timely with your bills, then it kind of signals to the bank that would I want to lend this person because they may not pay me back.
Right.
Remember, it's not just access to the credit and when you get a debt, but also the only way that becomes a good servant or a good tool is if you show that you can use the tool responsibly.
Right.
And to use the tool responsibly, you have to repay.
Fair.
And repay on time. And
Correct.
keep to your end of the bargain. And that way, it allows you even more access to credit
Correct.
and
So-
more opportunity.
Let's get a little specific. It may vary institution to institution, but are there set time frames over which these things are observed? For example, if you were to acquire some bad debt, that stands for the rest of your life, or can that be repaired?
Right. So interestingly, a lot of this gets recorded for a very long period of time. Now, that said, that doesn't mean it's a life sentence. There is forgiveness. There's parole with good behavior, So as your behaviors improve and regularize, and as maybe you settle past bad debts, it gets adjusted.
Okay.
Right? So so don't get me wrong. It's never a scenario where there's no coming back.
Okay.
There's always an opportunity to redeem. There's always an opportunity to correct. And that's the good thing. Because we all recognize we make mistakes. I mean,
Exactly.
early in your career, you may have paid your credit cards late. And we understand that. So those things get rectified over time.
Thankfully. Because the truth is, we don't have these conversations in our schools.
Exactly.
We don't have these conversations in our homes sometimes because there's a lot of, what is it, trial by fire? Baptism by fire.
Yes.
Where people learn about their credit, their income, the way their money works by doing it. So that I'm happy to hear there are those options. But what can we do? Because prevention is better than cure to avoid those pitfalls.
Well, so I want to address that in two ways. One is prevention, as you said. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Obviously, get the right type of knowledge, get the right type of education. This forum here is a perfect opportunity to start building your financial literacy. I would say start exposing yourself to more and more information, neutral information about the subject matter. So that's the first thing. I mean, your knowledge, wealth, and poverty is all in the head at the end of the day. So if you want to really prepare yourself for, to make sure that you don't make those mistakes, get the right knowledge first and foremost. Then, of course, get advice. Seek maybe multiple counselors. You could talk to 3 or 4 people who are in fairly decent positions. In a banker, somebody who is a senior person who's had some experience, versus speaking to cousin Harry, who has no idea about money, and he's had a different money experience, but his experience may not relate directly to yours. And by the time he explains it with his filter, the advice is so skewed that when you take that advice, you wouldn't get the kind of result that you're looking for. So seek the right type of guidance, make sure it's qualified, and then get multiple bits of advice. So second opinions are always really good to have. And then sometimes a little bit of trial and error is not a bad thing. You know, you try, if you err, no problem, as Jason was saying, it's not a life sentence with things like credit. With the passage of time, bad records are displaced by good records.
Exactly.
And you know, if you're dealing with responsible bankers, as I know there are many responsible bankers now, they can actually sit with you and counsel you and say, you know what, this is what you did wrong. Maybe you should go and try to fix this area. And then come back. You know, when I was a loans officer, we used to tell people that check us back in a couple of years. Do these things. When you come back in a couple of years, get your debt down. And then we could entertain a different, we could have a different conversation.
But you know, Trin Begonians, you get turned on for a loan. You're going to tell Paul you get turned on for a loan because this loans officer is awful. That's usually the dialogues. So to hear, in fact, that the conversations are very specific to the individual person is very important. What might apply to me might not apply to you. And it doesn't mean that it's absolutely a no from the entire institution for the rest of my life.
Exactly.
That's right.
And that is not the part that we Trin Begonians carry. So pay attention, guys. Don't listen to your friends.
I just want to add something on that as well. So remember, one is prevention and one is the cure. So let's talk a little bit about the cure, because some of the people who are listening to this session, this conversation right now, they may be in a situation where their loans are not being paid, maybe because of the pandemic, maybe because of a lot of job loss, maybe because of lack of knowledge. In fact, when I was a debt collector, I realized the majority of people whose loans went bad, people didn't go bad, their loans went bad because of mispayments. It's because they didn't have the information, the right information, and they misused the facility altogether. So I'd say if you found yourself in a situation where you have bad debt, you don't have to be a bad person. The debt is just a bad thing. You can work your way out of that. And I'd always say that the only thing to solve a bad debt is paying the debt. So if you found yourself in a situation where you're owing money, start with making some kind of payment. Hold out the olive branch and show that you're interested, because the person on the other end will see that you're interested, and maybe they will want to work with you to navigate out of debt. And then eventually you could move from being a bad debtor to being one of the best customers in the financial institution.
Exactly.
That's
how it goes.
Yeah.
That's good to know, because as you rightly said, somebody here is sitting and wondering, how do I get out of it? Obviously, making payments are one option. Anything to add in terms of a technique maybe that we can apply?
Is the discipline of it. So you talked about the customer who comes in and gets rejected or declined for a loan. And then they go out and may have only bad things to say. To be quite honest, I think from our experience, we've had customers in that very scenario who got declined, and they come back and thank us. And the reason why is that we were honest. And because you're not just stamping decline and it's not rejection, it is guidance as well too. So you're giving the person guidance for their own benefit. Say, listen, we really think this may not be appropriate for you at this time, but as Nicholas pointed out, with a little bit of time, with a little better plan, with a little better discipline and structure, you can achieve the goal you're trying to achieve in the right way. Get that money to be your servant, versus if we let you go down this road, you become the servant, and the money becomes the debt becomes the master.
Correct.
So, and the other thing I would say is that, just even having a conversation about money is difficult for most persons. That's why I think that we're so excited to be here, because this is you're removing the taboo, you're removing the demystifying the whole situation. And I find that's what makes it difficult for a lot of people. Money sounds like a foreign, distant language and land that they don't have access to, and that for some reason that we only talk about it when you're in trouble, when I have a money problem, versus saying I have a money plan.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think that's half the battle that people have, that is psychological, in that we could talk about stand plan. And so we used the example very early in this session about families around a table, and I did that deliberately because it should be also a conversation you have with the children.
Yes.
That this shouldn't be something that as adults we're not wrangling with. that even as a child sitting around the table, a dollar should be understood. What does this dollar mean?
Right.
And where does it come from? Mommy and Daddy ain't growing this in the backyard. You know, there's a whole understanding of this, where it comes from and what you could do with it and what you could accomplish with it.
Right.
So I think there's a lot that I hope we can accomplish,
Yes.
not only in this session, but in future sessions and this whole program to get to kind of change that mentality and mindset and help make all of this a lot more accessible to people.
Of course.
You know, before you go on, one of the things I observed when I was a child was money was taboo. You know,
Yes,
your child, you're not supposed to know about that. So that culture has found its way into the present. And as Jason is saying, you know, we could really be more inclusive, especially with
Yes.
children. You don't have to give them all the details.
Yeah.
But hearing on a positive note the things about money can really do a lot for a lifetime.
Yeah.
Now, those are the messages that we want to make sure stick with people.
Yes,
But
yes.
just to recap what we've learned today,
Correct.
apart from the fact that we are less shy about investing, we definitely need to seek advice from the experts themselves and from the institutions that are around us.
Yes.
We also need to look at these conversations on a more granular level at home, on an
Yes.
individual basis, and have them much more. Now, this is just the start, as you rightfully said. Hopefully, we have triggered something in your minds at home and
Yes,
begin the
yes.
discussion. But if people wanted to get more information, what were some of the resources that you found to be very, very, very instrumental in your financial security?
Oh, it's so, there's so much. I remember reading once, there was this book I was reading and the author said, read every business section in your newspapers for an entire year.
That's great advice.
And
Really?
I actually did it.
Yeah.
And you would not believe, after 1 year of reading all the business sections in all of the newspapers for an entire year, people started asking me for advice, even before I became qualified, because your knowledge starts to grow. So we all have it accessible. So turn that front page and go deeper into the newspapers and pull out the business section. Don't put it on the side, you know, and start reading it. Some of the information might be difficult to understand, but if you keep reading it over and over a period of time, you kind of connect the dots,
Yes.
and then it starts to make sense. And then you notice that your confidence changes, your attitude changes, your vision changes.
Chime
I
in.
love how how Nicholas started the answer, because to me that is the starting point. Reading, and then the other step in my mind is the questions that you ask, because you read and you may not necessarily understand, and that's okay, So you read the news, and it shouldn't just be I read the news. It should be why.
Yes.
Why are we doing this?
Yes.
What are the implications? What will happen to me if this were to go this way? What would happen to the economy? What is going to happen to inflation? What is going to happen to jobs? What's going to happen to foreign exchange? So questions should come out of the reading.
Yes.
And then those questions, seeking the answers, that is where the knowledge begins to happen.
Correct.
And of course, as Nicholas pointed out, Uncle Harry may not necessarily have all the answers. So guys like Nicholas, give him a call.
Right.
You know, seek out your banker, seek out someone you trust with financial advice, and get multiple views,
Yes.
and have conversations about it. And you know what it does? It begins to change what people talk about when they gather. So it's not just about the bacchanal. I mean, we love a bacchanal, right?
Yes.
It's not just about the bacchanal, but let's understand the implications. Well, what happens? Why this will happen?
Right.
What could we do about it? How is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect you?
Yes.
And what is going to happen in the future?
Yes.
Those kind of questions, as they begin to answer them, it creates a whole enlightenment and understanding.
Yeah. Every answer leads to a question. Every question leads to an answer. And it's never ending.
And on that note, before we have more questions and more answers
Yes.
coming to the people, we hope that we've at least given you some starting information, some building blocks, if you will,
Yes.
so that you can create your own financial security. Until the next one, ask questions, get those answers, and take those steps that are necessary towards your financial security. And that's how we'll wrap this episode of TT Online Community Voices, brought to you by the Ministry of Sports and Community Development.